On a late autumn evening in 1995, when the last light had slipped behind the Blackthorn Mountain Ridge and the fields outside Willow Creek were cooling under a slow, purple dusk, pilot Daniel Rourke walked across the dim tarmac of the town's small airstrip with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through hundreds of flights before. He moved with the calm, practiced rhythm of a man who understood the sky better than most people understood the roads beneath their own feet. To the mechanics finishing their shifts, he was exactly what he had always been, the dependable charter pilot who never cut corners, never pushed his luck, and never made mistakes. For 15 years, Daniel had been the man business owners, ranchers, and doctors paged when weather was turning or daylight was shrinking, and they needed someone who could fly blind, steady, and unshaken. And yet, on this evening, something about him seemed unusually tense, almost withdrawn, as he double-checked the small sealed cargo crate strapped into the back of his single-engine aircraft. He had received the job that morning from a private client he had flown for only once before a man who insisted on anonymity, who paid in advance, and who made it clear the crate was never to be opened. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who pushed into other people's business, so he didn't ask questions, but he did make note of the unusual weight of the crate when he hoisted it into the compartment and how the client avoided eye contact the entire time. His wife, Anna, later said that when he came home to grab his jacket before returning to the airfield, he was quieter than normal, as if weighing something in his mind. But Daniel insisted the job was simple. A quick flight over the ridge, 30 minutes round trip, nothing he hadn't done 100 times. Their son, 8-year-old Michael, followed him to the driveway, begging for a longer hug than usual. Daniel laughed it off, wishing him good night, promising he'd be home before his bedtime slipped past the first hour. Weather radars showed mild turbulence moving near the ridge, nothing concerning, nothing that would deter a pilot of Daniel's experience. The forecast predicted steady winds and only light pockets of descending air over the highest peaks. Air traffic control cleared him without delay. At 7:14 p.m., Daniel eased the nose of the aircraft forward, letting the machine gather lift before pulling it into the sky. From the ground, the plane's lights rose like drifting stars before disappearing into the thick, slow-moving layer of clouds stretching over the mountains. The radio transmission he gave during the ascent was calm and typical, noting his elevation, course, and estimated arrival time. If anyone had been listening without context, they would have heard nothing out of the ordinary, no hesitation, no stress, no hint that anything was wrong. But only 22 minutes later, everything changed. At 7:36 p.m., the transponder signal vanished. 1 second it was there, an ordinary blip on the radar, and the next, it was gone. Operators at the Regional Flight Center initially assumed a simple signal dropout, something that happened occasionally when small planes dipped beneath certain pockets of rock. They attempted contact, first with routine calls, then with increasingly urgent ones. No response. The secondary radar failed to detect even a faint return. Air traffic control logged the first formal alert just before 7:45 p.m., well within standard procedure. But within the hour, their concern escalated to something more serious. Weather conditions hadn't changed. There were no storms, no lightning, and the aircraft had not been tracked descending or diverting. At 8:30 p.m., the county sheriff was notified. By 9:15, search and rescue volunteers were being organized. Word reached Anna shortly after, as she paced the living room, expecting to hear the sound of her husband's truck crunching into the driveway. Instead, she opened the door to 2 deputies, gently asking when she last had contact with him. The moment she heard the words, "missing aircraft," something inside her collapsed. Her voice trembled as she tried to make sense of the information he was only supposed to be gone for half an hour. He knew the ridge better than anyone. He had flown that exact route for years. Michael watched from behind her, silently gripping the doorframe, unable to understand why everyone suddenly looked so afraid. Search teams mobilized through the night. Helicopters swept broad arcs over the mountain ridge, using night vision equipment to scan for heat signatures, wreckage, or fires. Nothing appeared, not a single glint of metal, not a plume of smoke, not even the faint, irregular reflection of broken glass. On the ground, searchers with flashlights combed the initial area where the transponder was last detected, calling out Daniel's name even though everyone knew he could not have survived a high-speed crash without immediate visibility. Yet calling his name made them feel as though the darkness was listening, as though something might still answer. By dawn, more than 60 volunteers and rescue personnel were scouring the ridge. The terrain was some of the most unforgiving land in the region: tight ravines, steep cliffs, loose rock shelves that broke without warning beneath shifting weight. But still, these were areas Daniel had flown over for years. The idea that he had simply vanished made no sense. Aircraft do not just disappear. They crash, they burn, they leave debris. But days passed, and the mountain remained silent. Not a single piece of wreckage was found. No oil stains, no scorch marks, no broken treetops. It was as if the plane had been swallowed whole by the ridge, leaving nothing behind. As search operations continued, investigators began looking deeper into Daniel's background, hoping to uncover any clue that might explain such a sudden disappearance. They interviewed his colleagues, all of whom described him as methodical, predictable, almost overly cautious. He logged every minor mechanical concern, even ones other pilots ignored. He avoided unnecessary risks, respected storms, and had a clean accident history. His financial record showed no debt, no unusual purchases, no signs of personal distress. The private client who hired him for the final flight was questioned, but he provided only minimal information and insisted the crate contained sensitive equipment, nothing dangerous or illegal. He refused to elaborate. Investigators noted his evasiveness, but could not tie him to wrongdoing. Anna spent those first days in stunned disbelief, moving between the sheriff's office and the mountain base camp, refusing to accept the possibility that her husband might be gone. Search captains tried to prepare her for the likelihood of no survivors, but she clung to the conviction that if Daniel had gone down, he would have found a way to signal them. She believed in his skill, in his calm under pressure, in his ability to fight through any disaster. Michael, unable to grasp the finality of the situation, kept waiting at the window every morning, convinced his father would walk back through the door wearing the same warm, tired smile he always had after long flights. By the third week, the emotional strain began breaking people down. Search and rescue volunteers were bruised and exhausted. Deputies were running on minimal sleep. Experienced pilots who had flown similar routes were brought in to consult, and their conclusions only deepened the mystery. The physics of the disappearance didn't make sense. Even if the plane had broken apart mid-air, debris would have been scattered across miles. If it had crashed intact, there would be a crater, smoke, or at the very least, disturbed ground. But there was nothing. No evidence of fire or fuel, no radio calls, no emergency beacon. Nothing to suggest intentional diversion either. Daniel had no connection to crime, no reason to disappear voluntarily. As weeks turned into months, investigators started to consider more unconventional explanations, not supernatural ones, but mechanical failures so sudden and catastrophic that they left no trace. They explored the possibility of electrical failure accompanied by a steep, unseen descent into a remote crevice. They analyzed wind models, questioning whether a rare downdraft could have dragged the plane into an area that searchers had not reached. Satellite imagery from neighboring counties was reviewed, but the resolution in those years was too poor to reveal much. Every theory crumbled under the absence of physical evidence. By the end of the 6th week, search efforts were officially scaled back. Authorities admitted that, for the moment, they had reached the limits of what manpower and probability could uncover. But the emotional damage lingered. Anna's home, once filled with warmth and noise, grew unnervingly quiet. Nights became the hardest she kept. Daniel's jacket draped over the back of the couch, hoping the familiar weight might comfort her. Michael grew withdrawn, carrying the unspoken memory of the night deputies came to the door. And the town, confused and shaken, found itself unable to explain how one of its most trusted pilots could vanish without a single clue left behind. In the end, the investigators produced a report acknowledging 3 possibilities: a mechanical malfunction, an act of sabotage, or a deliberate course diversion. But none could be supported with evidence. The truth was simple and devastating. They didn't know what happened. The plane was gone, Daniel was gone, and the Blackthorn mountain ridge now carried a mystery so deep and unnerving that even seasoned investigators struggled to close the file. Yet as the final report was signed and the search teams packed away their equipment, no one realized that the mountain was not finished with this story. There was something hidden deep within its cliffs, something untouched for decades, waiting for the right moment and the right people to finally bring the truth to light. In the days that followed Daniel Rourke's disappearance, the quiet mountain town of Willow Creek transformed into the center of one of the largest search operations the region had ever seen. At first, people believed the aircraft must have gone down somewhere along the pilot's expected route. The Blackthorn mountain ridge was harsh, but not endless. A crash site had to be there. It had to be findable, and in the early hours of the operation, that belief pushed dozens of volunteers and seasoned rescuers into the cold terrain with an intensity fueled by equal parts hope and denial. No one wanted to imagine that a man as skilled as Daniel could simply vanish without trace. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't inexperienced, and he wasn't the type to deviate from procedure. Everyone involved clung to the same assumption. They just hadn't looked in the right place yet. Helicopters arrived from neighboring counties, sweeping over the jagged skyline in slow, overlapping grids. Their rotors threw ripples across the frost-laced treetops as they hovered near cliffs and deep ravines, trying to spot anything metallic or out of place. Scent dogs were led into the densest parts of the forest, their handlers hoping they would pick up the faintest trace of aviation, fuel, or human scent. National Guard reservists volunteered to join the mission, forming search lines that moved cautiously along the ridge, probing through brush, overturning loose rock, and marking areas already covered. They worked day after day, pushed by the urgency of knowing that if Daniel had somehow survived an impact, every hour mattered. Temperatures were dropping rapidly at night, and the mountain had a reputation for turning cold faster than weather stations predicted. But the ridge itself fought back. It was the kind of terrain only experienced mountaineers could navigate safely. Sheer rock faces carved steep, narrow canyons that trapped fog and killed visibility within seconds. The deeper search teams went, the more they found themselves swallowed by sudden drops of temperature and shifting light that made midday feel like dusk. Multiple volunteers reported strange echoes, voices, or calls that bounced unpredictably, creating the illusion of sound coming from one direction when it was actually coming from the opposite. Search coordinators logged the phenomenon as environmental distortion, but it caused several false leads. Teams would scramble toward what sounded like a human voice, or the distant thump of metal, only to find empty ravines or trickling water masking as something else. For the first week, adrenaline kept everyone moving. But as days turned into double-digit counts and not a single piece of wreckage surfaced, doubt seeped in. Pilots assisting in the air searches began questioning the physics. A plane that size, carrying that much fuel, should have left scars on the land. There should have been a debris field, scorched trees, broken branches, or even a small burn pattern visible from above. But the ground looked undisturbed, as though nothing had fallen from the sky at all. Rescue workers started revisiting earlier assumptions, pulling out maps, recalculating wind patterns, and reviewing the radar logs that captured Daniel's last known location. The crate Daniel had been transporting quickly turned into a focal point of suspicion. Investigators revisited the private client who had hired him, pushing harder for details. But the man refused to disclose the contents, citing confidentiality agreements. His evasiveness triggered speculation. Officers wondered if the cargo had been dangerous chemicals, rare metals, even something illicit. But without a manifest or permission to open the crate prior to the flight, all they had were guesses. The lack of transparency complicated the investigation, making every theory darker, heavier, and more difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, Daniel's wife, Anna, refused to accept the official belief that he had simply gone down along the expected flight path. She insisted that if a storm cell or mechanical problem had forced him into emergency maneuvers, he would have attempted to divert toward one of the neighboring valleys, both of which had flatter terrain and greater chances of a survivable landing. In her mind, Widening the search radius wasn't just logical, it was necessary. She pleaded with authorities to extend operations beyond the original grid, arguing that Daniel would never have passively followed a doomed trajectory. Despite her exhaustion, she showed up at every briefing, scanning maps, asking questions, and refusing to let the search narrow. Her conviction pushed the sheriff's department to open new ground, sending teams into rougher, less accessible parts of the region. Some of these areas were so steep and treacherous that rescuers had to rely on climbing ropes just to descend safely. But even with the expanded search, the mountain yielded nothing. As the second week folded into the third, frustration grew among the investigators. They gathered in late-night meetings analyzing every possible scenario. One theory was structural failure, a catastrophic break mid-air. But that should have produced a wide scatter of debris. Another theory focused on intentional disappearance, though nothing in Daniel's life supported that idea. He had a stable job, a secure home, a loving family. People who knew him dismissed the notion immediately. A darker theory suggested hijacking someone, forcing him to land in an isolated area. But the flight wasn't publicly advertised. The crate wasn't known to anyone except the mysterious client, and no unauthorized transmissions were recorded. Then came the possibility of smuggling, the idea that Daniel might have been unknowingly transporting illegal material and was intercepted mid-flight. But again, there was no evidence tying Daniel to criminal networks or illicit activities. Each theory collapsed the moment investigators pushed past speculation into facts. The longer the case dragged on, the heavier the emotional atmosphere became. Volunteers began to feel the strain of the search, the sleepless nights, the bruises, the cuts from thorns and sharp rock, the constant chill that seeped into their bones. The sheriff worried about the toll it was taking on his deputies, who were working with minimal rest and carrying equipment across terrain that seemed designed to break spirits. Conversations that initially held confident optimism now hovered with quiet dread. The mountain had a history of rejecting answers, swallowing hikers, hunters, and even experienced outdoorsmen. But none of those disappearances came close to the scale or mystery of this one. By the 8th week, donations and support began to dwindle. Families who lived in towns near the ridge offered meals, supplies, and places for rescuers to rest. But sustaining the operation required state funding and personnel. And when no new leads surfaced, people in administrative positions began questioning the resources being used. Investigators felt the pressure every hour spent without results made the case increasingly vulnerable to decisions made far from the mountain. In an attempt to break the stalemate, they brought in additional aviation experts and geologists to propose new explanations. Some suggested hidden crevices or collapsed rock formations that could have buried the aircraft. Others pointed toward extreme downdrafts, rare but possible events that might have forced the plane downward so violently that it disappeared into terrain unseen from above. But even these ideas offered no pathways to evidence. No disturbed soil, no fuel residue, no scratches on the trees. It was as if the aircraft had been lifted into the clouds and simply never returned. The 11th week marked the breaking point. Searchers had gone over the same areas multiple times. They had climbed unstable ledges, crossed freezing streams, and navigated claustrophobic ravines, so narrow they blocked the sun entirely. And yet each day ended the same, with empty hands and exhausted bodies. Finally, with winter approaching and resources stretched to their limits, officials made the painful announcement. The active search would be suspended. Only tip-based follow-ups would continue. The case was declared cold. For Anna, the moment was devastating. She stood at the command post gate as trucks rolled away and the last helicopter lifted off, carrying with it the final bit of hope she thought she had left. Her face stayed expressionless, but her silence told its own story. She wasn't mourning a confirmed death. She was grieving the absence of truth, the uncertainty that would now follow her for years. Michael, still too young to understand the word cold case, absorbed the silence around him in a way children do, shaping it into something mythic and personal. As he grew older, he would tell people that the mountain had taken his father, as though the ridge itself were a living thing with secrets buried in its stone. And as the years continued to pass without a single clue, people in town began to echo his word. They said the mountain kept what it wanted. They said it swallowed the plane. They said no one was meant to find it. But 30 years later, when the truth finally surfaced, it would become clear that the mountain hadn't kept the secret out of malice. It had simply hidden it in a place no one thought to look, waiting, unmoving, until the right set of eyes stumbled upon what countless others had missed. For decades, the case sits in a kind of suspended grief, a wound the town quietly learns to live around, even as it never really heals, and the people who remember Daniel find themselves pulled back to the same questions every time the seasons change and the first snow touches the ridge where he disappeared. His family becomes the reluctant center of a mystery that refuses to fade. Former co-workers speak of him in careful tones, as if the years have made the story heavier, not easier, and the older investigators, those who once spent night after night tracing flight paths across printed maps, carry their memories like unfinished work. Daniel's wife becomes the most enduring symbol of that unresolved loss. She remains in the same small house where they built their life, refusing to move even when relatives urge her to consider a fresh start. She keeps the porch light burning every night for 30 long years, a quiet ritual that neighbors come to recognize from the highway, the lone glow on an empty road that makes travelers wonder what story lives inside that house. People say she never stopped believing that one day Daniel would walk up the steps again, that somehow he had found a way to survive out there and just needed time to make it home. It becomes such a constant part of the town's identity that even after the bulb burns out and is replaced, everyone knows why the light stays on. Investigators from the original search age into retirement, and when they speak about the case, there is always a moment when they pause before answering, as if trying to decide whether the truth is that they did everything possible or that the mountain simply swallowed something they never had the tools to find. Some admit that what haunts them most isn't the lack of evidence, but the presence of strange near clues echoes in the canyon that led them miles off course. What looked like debris but wasn't, a radar blip that vanished before they could confirm it. Over time, these memories blend with the town's folklore, but the people who lived through it still remember the tension of those first weeks, the way the roar of every passing aircraft made people stop what they were doing and tilt their heads slightly upward, hoping for a sign. The private client who hired Daniel for that final flight becomes another source of quiet speculation. At first, he is simply a name on an invoice, an impatient businessman who insisted the crate arrive before sunrise. But only a few months after Daniel vanishes, the man drops out of public record altogether. His office closes. His property is sold. No forwarding address, no public filings, nothing that explains where he went or why. A few investigators try to track him down years later, but there is no trail, not even a rumor of where he might have relocated. The disappearance of the client becomes its own side mystery, one that fuels conspiracy theories but ultimately leads nowhere. Was he running from something? Or did he simply change his life and slip beneath the radar at the wrong moment, leaving behind a gap that people later filled with suspicion? With no evidence, the question becomes another loose thread in a case already tangled with them. As technology advances, each new generation brings renewed attempts to search the ridge again. In the late 1992, a group of pilots volunteers to sweep a wider corridor using upgraded aerial imaging. In the early 2000s, a nonprofit organization proposes a ground-penetrating radar survey of the valley floor. Years later, hobbyist drone operators map out the canyons with high-resolution cameras, convinced they will be the ones to find the wreckage. Every time someone thinks they've pinpointed an anomaly, a suspicious shadow beneath the tree line, a metallic flash caught in the afternoon sun, the hope rises again, fragile but real. And every time, the mountain takes it back. The shadows resolve into fallen logs. The metallic flash turns out to be a rusted hunting blind. The anomalies become disappointments, and the people who search are left with the same uncomfortable silence that defined the early days of the investigation. The town becomes accustomed to bursts of speculation. A fisherman finds a rusted aluminum fragment near a creek one summer and hikes it 3 miles out, convinced it belongs to Daniel's plane. A mechanic swears he hears the rumble of an old engine late at night in the foothills, a sound he claims is too low and too steady to be a modern aircraft. Teenagers exploring an abandoned fire road report seeing something reflective in a ravine. Each story circulates for a week or two before dissolving into the background noise of local rumor, and the family learns to brace themselves every time someone knocks on the door to share a new tip. For Daniel's wife, each rumor feels like reopening a wound she's spent years trying to stitch closed. For his son, who grows up with only fragmented memories of his father, each rumor becomes a temporary spark of hope that inevitably fades, reinforcing the same story he's told himself since he was young, that the mountain took his father in a way no one can explain. What changes over 30 years isn't the evidence, because no evidence ever appears but the emotional landscape surrounding the case. People who were once children during the original search become adults with their own families, and they talk about the disappearance with the kind of hushed respect normally reserved for the tragedies that define a community. The elders recall the final days of the search as if recalling a severe storm or a wildfire, something that swept into their lives and left everyone feeling smaller afterward. The investigators, who are still alive, speak with a heaviness that suggests they never stopped replaying the case, even in retirement, wondering what tiny detail they might have missed. Over time, the mystery becomes part of the town's collective identity, an ever-present reminder that there are places the human eye simply cannot reach, and moments where even the most experienced search teams are outmatched by terrain and circumstance. People learn to avoid certain parts of the ridge after dark. Hunters talk about unsettling stillness in the higher elevations. Hikers say that weather moves strangely there, that storms roll in without warning, and sound behaves differently, carrying voices farther than it should or muffling them entirely. None of these experiences are ever linked to Daniel in any concrete way, but his name is always the first to appear in conversation whenever something unusual happens near the canyon. As the years continue to pass, the people closest to him age into a quiet acceptance. Though none of them ever call it closure, his wife's porch light remains a fixture of the neighborhood, a symbol that outlives even the people who originally understood it. His son grows up learning to balance the ache of not knowing with the practical reality that some questions go unanswered, yet he never quite stops feeling that the mountain holds some truth that hasn't yet surfaced. Interviews with him reveal a man shaped by absence, by the slow-moving grief of watching time erase the urgency of a loss without ever offering the resolution that might finally put it to rest. And still, every few years, the story stirs again. An outdoor enthusiast posts a photo online of a piece of twisted metal half buried in soil. A retired ranger claims he saw something decades earlier but never reported it. A storm washes out a section of hillside, exposing rock and debris no one remembers seeing before. These moments rarely amount to anything concrete, but they keep the mystery alive, giving people just enough reason to believe the story isn't truly over. Even after 3 decades, the passage of time itself becomes part of the unanswered question, deepening the sense that something has been waiting in the mountains all along, untouched, unchanged, and unseen. And as the anniversary approaches for the 30th time, the town prepares to move through another year of quiet remembrance, unaware that far above them, in the frozen shadow of the ridge, a discovery is about to surface, one that will force everything they thought they knew about Daniel's disappearance to shift, and finally reveal something the mountain has kept hidden for far too long. 30 years after Daniel vanished, the mountain had settled back into its usual silence, carrying the weight of a mystery that most people assumed would never move again. But on an early autumn morning, 3 seasoned climbers, men who had spent years testing themselves against remote cliffs and hostile ridges, set out toward a place that even the original search teams had been reluctant to enter, a narrow, jagged ravine known locally as Deadwind Chasm. It was the kind of place locals warned hikers to avoid, a sheer cut in the earth where unpredictable rock slides had claimed more than one life and where the canyon walls pinched tight enough in some sections to steal the wind from your breath. The climbers were not thrill-seekers but methodical explorers who had recently become fascinated by the idea of mapping uncharted mountain routes, and Deadwind Chasm was one of the last untouched regions on their list. They approached it with quiet respect, knowing the risks, aware that the walls were unstable and prone to sudden shifts, but convinced that with the right gear and timing they could navigate the ascent. The further they climbed, the more they realized why it had been ignored for so long. Loose shale slid under their boots, echoing into the depths, and the air grew colder and heavier as sunlight struggled to reach the narrow floor far below. Their focus stayed on handholds and anchors, until one of them paused and narrowed his eyes at something that didn't belong, a faint glint from a narrow ledge several meters above them, too bright, too rigid, too clean-lined to be stone. At first they dismissed it as a trick of light, a reflection off wet rock, but as the angle of the sun shifted, the glint sharpened into something unmistakably metallic. Climbers don't take chances, not with their lives or their assumptions, so they adjusted their route, edging carefully toward the ledge. Each movement dislodged bits of gravel that rattled into the darkness below, reminding them that if they made a wrong decision, they'd be adding their names to the long list of accidents the chasm was known for. When they finally reached the ledge, they realized they were staring at something far more significant than they had imagined. It wasn't a discarded tool or a piece of lost equipment. It was a smooth, curved panel jutting from the rock, scored by impact damage but strangely intact, and as their hands brushed the cold metal, an eerie, sinking recognition set in. This was part of an aircraft, not a small scrap, not a twisted remnant, but a substantial section of fuselage, wedged vertically between two towering stone columns as if the mountain had swallowed it whole and held it in place. For a moment none of them said anything, stunned by the impossibility of finding a hidden structure of that size in a place no one ever thought to look, and even more stunned by the realization that it must have been here for decades, invisible to aerial searches, protected by the ravine's impossible angles. They moved slowly around the metal, inspecting it with the cautious reverence of people who understood they were standing inches from a human tragedy. The fuselage was weathered but not destroyed, shielded from storms by the chasm walls, and the cold shade had preserved more than time should have allowed. They climbed higher along the narrow ledge, scanning for additional evidence, and that was when one of them froze mid-step at the sight of something half buried between stones. It looked like a boot, old but eerily intact, the leather stiffened by decades of cold. At first they questioned whether it could belong to some lost hiker or hunter, but the location made that unlikely, and the shape of it, military style, thick-soled, the kind pilots often wore, forced them to confront the terrible possibility forming in their minds. When they examined it more closely, their stomachs tightened. Inside the boot, cushioned in darkness, were small fragments of bone. Not many, but enough to make the truth undeniable. This wasn't debris. This wasn't rumor or speculation. This was a human life that had ended here, preserved by isolation and temperature and the sheer difficulty of ever reaching this place. None of the climbers were reckless enough to disturb anything further. They knew that moving evidence, even unintentionally, could damage the integrity of whatever investigation might follow. Instead, they pulled out their devices and documented everything with crisp, deliberate motions, close photographs of the fuselage paneling, wide shots of the vertical wedge where the aircraft remained jammed, careful images of the boot and its grim contents. They recorded the GPS coordinates twice, triple-checked them, and talked quietly among themselves about how strange it was to be standing in the middle of a discovery that should have been impossible. The magnitude of what they had found pressed down on them with every breath. For 3 decades, search teams, investigators, and grieving family members had speculated endlessly about where Daniel could have gone, what might have happened, whether he had tried to land, crashed in the forest, or disappeared into some hidden valley, and yet no one had ever considered this ravine because it was too dangerous, too unstable, too invisible from above. The climbers felt an uncomfortable mix of awe and sorrow, knowing they might have just rewritten the ending of a story that had tormented a small community for half a lifetime. They descended carefully, the weight of the discovery making each movement feel heavier, as if the chasm itself resisted their departure. Once they reached a safe clearing farther down the mountain, they checked reception and immediately contacted authorities, not with excitement, but with the solemn urgency of people reporting something deeply unsettling. The dispatcher on the other end of the line didn't grasp the full magnitude at first, but the climbers insisted this wasn't a rumor or a guess. They had found an aircraft fuselage and human remains in a location that had never been searched. They agreed to stay in place until officials arrived, and while they waited, the reality of what they had stumbled upon settled across them like a quiet, heavy fog. They talked in low voices about the pilot who must have fought to keep the plane stable in the final moments, about how improbable it was that the wreckage had remained unseen for so long, and about the families who had spent years hoping for answers that never came. When the first responders finally reached them, rangers, deputies, rescue personnel, they listened carefully as the climbers recounted exactly what they had found. The GPS coordinates were relayed to command officials, and confirmation began moving up the chain of agencies. Within hours, specialized recovery teams were already preparing to approach the chasm, aware that accessing the wreckage would require precision, caution, and time. The climbers watched as the officials cross-checked the coordinates with old search maps, and a quiet shock rippled through the group when everyone realized the same thing. Deadwind Chasm had been listed as too unstable for ground teams and too visually obstructed for aerial teams. It had been, unintentionally, the perfect hiding place, and for 30 years, it had kept its secret intact. News traveled quickly, moving from radio chatter to official dispatch reports to hushed conversations among law enforcement. A case that had been considered cold beyond hope had suddenly become active again, and the implications of that shift were enormous. Evidence that had eluded thousands of search hours was now sitting on a narrow ledge in a ravine barely wide enough for sunlight. The climbers sensed that their discovery would change not just the investigation, but the emotional climate of the town that had lived with uncertainty for 3 decades. They imagined Daniel's family, still waiting, still wondering, finally hearing that something had been found, something real, something undeniable, and they wondered what that news would feel like after so many years of silence. Before leaving the mountain, one of the climbers looked back at the ridge, feeling an odd chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The ravine looked unchanged, indifferent, as if it had simply allowed a glimpse of what it had been holding all along. And as the climbers began their descent toward the trailhead with law enforcement escorting them, there was a sense that the mountain itself had shifted, not physically, but in the meaning it carried. It was no longer just a place of danger or speculation. It was now a site of truth, partial, fragile, and buried in rock, but truth nonetheless. For the first time in 3 decades, the disappearance was no longer just whispers and theories. It was evidence, and evidence demanded answers. And while authorities prepared teams, notified investigators, and began planning how to safely extract the wreckage from Deadwind Chasm, a quiet ripple spread through everyone involved, an understanding that whatever they found next inside the fuselage, near the ledge, or deeper within the ravine was going to rewrite the story in ways no one was ready for. Recovering the wreckage from Deadwind Chasm became one of the most delicate operations the region had ever attempted, requiring not only expert climbers but structural engineers, forensic specialists, and investigators who had long since stopped expecting anything new in the case. The ravine's walls were treacherous, forcing teams to move inch by inch along unstable ledges as they cut away sections of the fuselage and transferred them to anchored platforms. Every piece was tagged, photographed, logged, and bundled for airlift, and the entire process took several days of uninterrupted focus. When they finally lifted out the boot containing scraps of bone, the mood grew quiet, solemn, and heavy, as if everyone understood they were carrying not just evidence, but the last physical trace of a life frozen at its final moment. Further up the ledge, they located more remains, small fragments protected by the cold and the way the aircraft had become wedged. From the position of the seat frame, the orientation of the harness, and the distribution of injuries, the forensic team concluded that Daniel had died on impact, likely within seconds, with no sign of survival after the crash. But while that answered one part of the decades-long mystery, it did nothing to explain how the plane had ended up in a near-vertical position, hidden in a place that had escaped every previous search. For that, investigators turned to the aircraft systems themselves, examining the engine components and avionics modules, hauled out piece by piece until they found what they hoped for but never expected: a damaged but partially preserved cockpit voice recorder. Decades of cold had slowed the degradation, giving analysts a slim chance to salvage something meaningful. When they brought the recorder into the lab and opened its casing, they were stunned to find the memory board still holding fragments of audio. It would take days of digital reconstruction to make anything intelligible. But for investigators who had spent 30 years with nothing but speculation, this was a breakthrough that felt almost surreal. At the same time, they examined the engine remains. discovering signs of normal mechanical function. Up until the final seconds, no evidence of sabotage, fuel contamination, or internal failure. The breakthrough came when the audio technicians returned with a 10-second snippet that included Daniel's strained breathing and the first hint of wind buffeting the cabin. As they pieced together more, a picture began to form, one far more violent and harrowing than any early theory had ever suggested. For nearly 2 minutes before impact, Daniel had been fighting a sudden and extreme downdraft, something powerful enough to yank the aircraft off course and push it downward faster than the plane could compensate. Weather specialists were called in to analyze archived atmospheric data, and what they found was a rare combination of temperatures and pressure shifts that, under the right conditions, could have created a microburst over the ridge at the exact moment of Daniel's flight. These microbursts, often invisible and unpredictable, were capable of slamming aircraft toward the ground with devastating force, and at the time of Daniel's disappearance, this specific mountain region had no documented history of such events. Radar had shown only mild turbulence, but microbursts often escape detection entirely, emerging in seconds and disappearing just as fast. For investigators who had spent years entertaining theories of mechanical failure, sabotage, intentional disappearance, or smuggling, the explanation was both relieving and heartbreaking. Daniel had been overwhelmed by a phenomenon even experienced pilots struggled to survive. As they reconstructed the final minutes of his flight, another piece of evidence changed the narrative even further. When the wreckage team recovered the interior cockpit wall, they found Daniel's flight map still pinned in place, its corners brittle but the route markings visible. Using digital scans, forensic cartographers overlaid the flight line onto modern topographic data and discovered that Daniel had deviated by 8 degrees off his assigned path. Investigators initially questioned whether this deviation had been an intentional act, but when they matched the shift with the microburst modeling, the deviation made perfect sense. Daniel had likely seen the early shape of the storm building to the west, perhaps darkening clouds or an unusual downdraft, and adjusted his heading slightly to avoid what he believed was a developing danger. The 8-degree shift was consistent with a cautious correction, not a deliberate detour. More importantly, it aligned perfectly with the trajectory that placed him directly in the path of the descending microburst, leaving him with almost no chance to escape once the wind shear hit. When technicians recovered the final section of audio from the cockpit recorder, they uncovered something even more devastating: fragments of Daniel's attempted radio calls. Most of the message was lost in static and wind noise, but analysts managed to isolate several words: turning back, losing altitude, and trying to reach valley. It was enough to reconstruct his intentions in the last seconds of his life. He had not been attempting to disappear or divert his route for illicit reasons. He had been trying to loop back toward safety, likely aiming for the open valley where an emergency landing would have been possible. But the microburst robbed the aircraft of lift faster than he could recover. The final seconds of audio captured the rising whine of the engine as he fought against the downdraft, trying desperately to climb. There was no panic, only the steady, strained breathing of a pilot focused entirely on survival. The recorder ended abruptly, matching the estimated time the aircraft slammed into the ravine walls and became wedged in its final resting place. Meanwhile, the crate Daniel had been transporting, once the subject of speculation, suspicion, and conspiracy theories, was found split open near the fuselage. The interior had been partially protected from the elements, allowing investigators to identify its contents clearly. Instead of weapons, drugs, or contraband, the crate held high-value geological survey instruments, including ground-penetrating sensors and specialized imaging equipment. The private client who had hired Daniel had requested discretion not because the contents were illegal, but because the company was involved in competitive mineral research and wanted to keep its findings confidential. Within the wreckage, investigators found no sign of tampering, no explosives residue, and no evidence that anyone besides Daniel had been on board. For the first time in 30 years, the weight of suspicion that had hovered over his final flight began to lift. As the pieces came together, investigators realized that the tragedy had been far simpler and far more devastating than any of the theories proposed in the early days of the case. Daniel had encountered a rare weather event at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place, an unexpected microburst forming directly over a mountain ridge with no room for recovery. The terrain beneath him was a maze of vertical rock columns and steep, unforgiving walls, leaving him nowhere to glide, nowhere to level out, nowhere to land. Everything that followed the missing plane, the decades without answers, the false rumors, the mysterious disappearance of the private client, all of it had been a series of coincidences and misunderstandings amplified by time. The mountain had not taken Daniel, the storm had. And the mountain had simply hidden the truth in a place no one had ever thought to look. But even as investigators prepared to brief Daniel's surviving family and release a formal statement, something in the wreckage still bothered them, a detail they couldn't quite reconcile with the rest of the evidence. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless studied closely, yet it raised questions that the recovered audio couldn't fully answer. And as specialists returned to the site to examine that anomaly, an uneasy understanding began to form there might be more to uncover in the ravine, something that could shift the narrative one final time. Daniel's son arrived at the crash site carrying 30 years of questions in the tightness of his shoulders, the kind of questions that don't fade with age but harden, settling into the quiet spaces of adulthood until they become part of a person's rhythm. He had heard the stories his entire life, whispers that his father might have flown off route for reasons no one understood, rumors that he'd been carrying illegal cargo, and worst of all, the suggestion that he had simply abandoned the family who depended on him. But when he stepped onto the cold ridge with investigators, there was none of that noise in his expression. There was only a stillness, a focus that had lived inside him since childhood, sharpened now by the reality that he stood only a few feet away from the truth that had eluded 3 decades of speculation. Forensic teams worked in a quiet, disciplined rhythm, methodically cataloging the wreckage under the watch of mountain wind that never seemed to rest. They had reconstructed what remained of the fuselage, the wings, and the partially crushed cockpit, aligning fragments of metal and shattered instrumentation, like a puzzle that had waited far too long for someone to take it seriously. What emerged from that reconstruction was not a pilot lost or careless, but a man who had been fighting for control until the very last possible second. Engineers explained that the final angle of impact, slightly banked, nose forced upward, showed a deliberate attempt to redirect the aircraft away from the ravine floor. It was an almost impossible maneuver in a losing battle, but one that reduced the violence of the crash by a margin that meant everything. It meant Daniel had not frozen. He had not panicked. He had made a calculation in the final heartbeat of his life, and he had acted on it with a clarity that only seasoned pilots understand. Investigators realized that if they had searched deeper during the early days of the disappearance, if they had followed the original grid patterns, search crews could have been funneling themselves straight into a terrain pocket prone to the same violent downdrafts that pulled Daniel's aircraft out of the sky. His last decision, the one made in a moment no one heard or recorded, may have prevented further deaths without anyone knowing. When the realization was presented to Daniel's son, he didn't react immediately. He just stood still, hands in his pockets, eyes moving over the slope as though tracing a path he had never walked but somehow knew. Then something in him softened, not relief exactly, but a shift, like a door opening inward after years of being stuck in place. For 30 years he had carried the weight of not knowing whether his father had chosen something over his family or whether he had simply been taken by circumstances people refused to understand. Now, with investigators laying out the pattern of the descent, he finally had permission to let go of those doubts. Down in the valley, Daniel's wife waited for the official report. She had lived through the aftermath of the disappearance in ways no one else could fully comprehend. There had been sympathy at first, enough to fill her home with casseroles and well-meaning concern, but sympathy had a timeline. Rumors, however, did not. They grew legs and wandered through the town, taking on their own life until they began to redefine her husband in the minds of people who had never met him. She learned to carry herself with a quiet resilience, telling herself she believed in him even when the world gave her reasons not to. When the officers finally sat down with her hands folded, voices steady, expression gentle, It took only a few sentences to undo years of doubt. They told her Daniel had not veered off course out of recklessness or secret intent. The deviation noted on the flight map had been a defensive maneuver to avoid the storm forming invisibly ahead of him. They explained that he had done everything right with the little warning he had, that he had fought violently against a microburst, so sudden and forceful that no pilot could have predicted it based on the weather data available in that era. And finally, they told her what the forensic reconstruction revealed. Her husband's last act was not desperation but an attempt to survive, an attempt to bring his aircraft back to the valley, an attempt to get home. The confirmation washed over her not as triumph but as quiet truth. It didn't erase the years spent living with unanswered questions, but it gave shape to the silence she had lived with. She pressed a hand against the written summary, the black and white technical language that described her husband's final moments, and she exhaled in a way that made the room feel different, lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally escaped. She didn't cry in front of the officers. She waited until they left, until the house was still, and the only sound was the distant hum of evening traffic. Then she let herself grieve properly, not for the loss itself, but for the version of her husband the world had constructed in his absence. That version no longer had power. The truth had reclaimed him. Back on the ridge, state aviation officials arrived within days of the forensic report. They mapped the surrounding air currents, wind tunnels, and sheer temperature differentials moving across the mountain face. What they found was surprising. This ridge, long rumored to be cursed among locals, was in fact positioned at the convergence of two competing weather patterns that could create sudden, violent microbursts without warning. In the years since Daniel's disappearance, technology had improved significantly, but this particular location had never been flagged because no one had enough data to understand the risk. Daniel's plane had been the first documented fatality linked to that hidden atmospheric hazard. Because of his crash, because of the analysis his wreckage now provided, statewide aviation charts were updated, warning zones were redrammed, pilots flying low-altitude routes were alerted to the danger. Training manuals incorporated the specifics of microburst formation in areas like these. The mountain, once spoken about in hushed tones as some sort of malevolent landscape, was now understood as a natural hazard shaped by cold air shearing off the peaks and collapsing downward with deadly force. The ridge hadn't claimed Daniel out of mystery. It had trapped him in a meteorological event invisible to the tools of his time. As the final reports were issued, climbers who had first spotted the wreckage returned to the ridge one last time. They stood on the cliff edge, looking down at the narrow band of twisted metal that had changed an entire family's history and rewritten 3 decades of small-town lore. They hadn't expected any of this when they'd first alerted authorities. They thought they were simply reporting what looked like an old crash site, unaware of the grief, rumors, and unanswered questions intertwined with it. Now, seeing investigators packing equipment, hearing radio chatter about updated flight warnings, they understood the scale of what their discovery had set in motion. The silence around them felt heavy but not ominous, just honest. The mountain wasn't cursed. It wasn't hiding secrets. It had simply held onto the truth until someone climbed high enough to see it. For Daniel's son, standing there beside them, the ridge no longer felt like a place of mystery. It felt like a place where his father's story had finally been returned to him intact. There was no legend left, no rumor powerful enough to rewrite the facts. His father hadn't abandoned his route, his cargo, or the people waiting for him at home. He had made a decision, fought against a phenomenon stronger than his aircraft, and used his final seconds to reduce the violence of what was coming. That mattered. It mattered in ways the son had never been able to articulate until now. As the wind pushed against his jacket and carried the faint echo of the valley below, he understood that the discovery had done more than identify remains, it had restored a legacy. And in the quiet that followed, with investigators preparing to leave and the daylight shifting across the ridge, he realized that the story wasn't ending here. It was settling into its rightful place, no longer a mystery, no longer a cautionary tale shaped by superstition, but a testament to a pilot who fought with everything he had, right up until the mountain took him. The climbers watched the sun sink behind the peaks, and in that fading light, they understood the full weight of what they had uncovered. Not just a wreckage lost to time, but the truth that had been buried with it, waiting 30 years for someone to bring it home.